Welcome to A Spot of Story with Danielle Grandinetti. Cozy up with your favorite beverage as we chat about sweet romance, thrilling suspense, and fascinating history. Perhaps you'll find your next read in one of these stories. On this episode of A Spot of Story, I'm chatting with S.R. Crickard. She lives in Ohio with her husband and some children, a bunch of dying plants, and a collection of taxidermy and animal bones. Well, that sounds interesting. After a career as a caseworker specializing in senior care, she now specializes in collecting homeschool curricula and then making up her own worksheets anyway. When she isn't running, reading, or searching for Lepidoptera in the woods, she is writing down characters who search for the good, true, and beautiful in unexpected places. Her fiction was featured in the 2012 anthology For the Good of the Realm, and her debut novel, Misshelved Magic, is the one we are talking about today. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk about Misshelved Magic. It's not our usual genre that we talk about here on the podcast, but your description of it, I was completely intrigued, and I'm excited to talk more. But first, since this podcast unites us over a love of story, I'd love to learn more about what you're currently reading.
I am currently reading a book called Between Two Worlds by Cheyenne Langveld. It's a historical fiction about a young woman who's captured while Rome is taking over Britain. So she gets captured, and it's very interesting. I just started it, so okay. I can't say much more about it than that, but it's good so far.
Let's turn to Misshelved Magic. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's about before we dive into more of the questions?
Yes, it's about a young woman named Adelina who gets a job as a librarian at the main library that's near the College of Magic, but she's not allowed in the magic section because she doesn't have magic. She's working in the history section and is told on day one, pretend all that magic stuff is not there. It has nothing to do with you. Those books put themselves away anyway. So that's why she knows something's going on when she keeps finding a spell book in her section. And it just won't stay where it belongs. And so she decides that she's gonna figure out how to return it because she's a librarian and her curiosity is piqued. And so that sets her on this path to start to discover things about magic in the world that have been ignored and that no one's really looked into until that point.
Ooh, sounds fun, which actually leads perfectly into my first question, and that is, what does a day in the life of your character look like?
She reminds me of a Miyazaki character. She likes to have her tea or her coffee with some sort of roll or something, just very quaint, whimsical, quiet life, which is why the story, nobody expects her to be this curious and nobody expects her to look into things. She likes to read. She'll read the morning paper because her family, they all like to kind of stay up on current events together. And so that's something she bonds with her family over, reads the paper, likes to take walks. Her father's a gardener, so she does like to spend time outdoors, taking long walks. And then she works at the library, so she spends most of her time at work, sorting books, finding books for people, and then using her free time to read. And then she just likes to go home and again have a quiet kind of life.
Until the book shows up.
Yes.
What was your favorite scene to write in this story and why?
So I don't want to give spoilers, but anybody who will have read it will know what I mean when I say that one of the characters gets a concussion. And it's a really funny development to have this character that has a concussion for part of the book, because concussions make you act funny and they make you confused and they can mess with your sense of smell and your sense of sight, and they don't make you hallucinate, but they can kind of mess with your perception of things. And I had just a lot of fun researching exactly like what kind of hijinks could having a concussion cause for somebody.
Speaking of research, what was some unique research you needed to do for this story?
When I chose the time period, this is set in like an alternate Edwardian time period. And the reason I picked that, and it's really funny in hindsight because I thought, well, when I was looking at kind of like historical time periods and some articles regarding like history, and I saw the Edwardian period and it's like 9 years long and it's just this tiny little like thing. And I was looking at sort of the fashion from that time and what was going on at that time. And I was like, I don't know anything about this, but it's 9 years. So what really could there be to learn? And I was so wrong because it turns out that like, well, and I'm saying 9 years, there's a little bit of discrepancy of how it's like 9 to 14 years. It's kind of from 1901 till the beginning of World War One, sort of. But it's this time period that had so much change and so much cultural change in such a short amount of time. And so when I sat down and thought, okay, I've randomly decided this is going to be set in the Edwardian period. Let me get some books on what that is. And I trotted down to the library and I told the librarian and that I need books about what daily life was like in the Edwardian period and what were people eating and what were people wearing and all of that. And she took my library card number and said, I'll put some books on hold for you. And I said, that's great. Thank you. And over the next 2 weeks, something like 30 books rolled in all about the Edwardian era, and I got them all. I'm not gonna lie and say I read them all cover to cover, but they were things like cookbooks and like new compiled newspapers and things, and it was just so fascinating because at this time, the telephone existed, but not everyone had one. It was more like your town had one, and you kinda had to, like, sign up for a time slot to use the phone, and electricity was sorta like half of the people if you lived in an urban area, you had electricity completely, like, your house was electric, but if you lived out in the country, you didn't have electricity yet. It was a time when there were both horse-drawn carriages and cars on the road. I mean, it was we were really in this weird place where it was both antiquated and modern at the same time. Like we hadn't completed the transition yet. And I just found that so fascinating. And I loved the idea of the world being in this sort of tension between old and new, while my character is in this tension between our old understanding of magic and everything that's being discovered now because of her refusal to just turn a blind eye. So I did a lot of research on the Edwardian era. I actually had to take a lot out of the book because it was more me just being like, this interesting fact and that interesting fact. It was like, this doesn't actually help the story, but there is still plenty in there that shows what an interesting time it was.
I love that. My stories are 1930s, but that transition of both old and new is just so fascinating to me and the amount of change that happened. Love that. But you actually led perfectly into my next question, which is what is a bit of research you wish you could have included that just didn't make the cut?
Oh, that's a good question. So one of the books I got was like a cookbook from the time. And so there were a lot of interesting foods that I kind of wish I could have mentioned in the story, but it takes place in a library. They're not walking around with food very much. Let me think if there's anything else. That period of time, Great Britain was still kind of expanding the empire. And so there were a lot of cultural habits and interesting events that happened that were very tied up in Great Britain occupying India or things like that that were too specific to the real world to really include in my fictional world. So things like King Edward, for whom the Edwardian era is named, very much liked rich foods, and it was a very prosperous time. So he was known for gaining weight very rapidly. Men would sit down and they would unbutton the bottom button when they sat, but when you stand up, you have to button it again, to be like very put together. And he became known for leaving the bottom couple buttons on his vest open just because his belly was bigger. And it caught on as a fashion trend of like young men stopped buttoning their buttons all the way down, and they would comment on it saying that it was like a riding coat, because when you're riding a horse, you don't want to have anything around your belly that's keeping you from being able to move with the horse. And so it brought on this style trend of jackets looking more and more like you were dressed like you were going to go riding, even when you weren't, kind of like how we wear our gym clothes everywhere now. And that was so interesting to me, but it was so specific to King Edward himself that it was just too specific to put in Misshelved Magic.
Ah, I love these little details.
And the other fun fact that I learned that I thought was so funny was they had this they called it the S-shaped silhouette. So large bust, large bottom, thin everywhere else, so that when you were standing to the side, you looked like the letter S. And nobody actually looks like that. And so the way they achieved that was with padding. So women would buy these, they were like cotton pillows, they were like pads of cotton that they would stuff in their clothes to achieve this silhouette. And there was this fashion guide, and it was for seamstresses, that I had flipped through to get a feel for how were women getting their clothes and things. And I laughed out loud because the woman writing this book for Edwardian seamstresses said, "Cotton will provide what God has forgotten." When she was talking about putting the padding in the clothing. And that was such a funny line to me, but again, there's nowhere to put this in the book, but it was such a funny line to me.
I love that. So, backing up, what was the inspiration behind writing this story?
So I was writing my big debut novel that was my grand story. And I still like that story, but it just had a lot of issues. I was working with alpha readers and friends who are also writers, and I just was having a lot of issues with that story, getting it to work. There was too much angst. It was very will they, won't they, way too reliant on them misunderstanding each other in silly ways to keep the tension. And I had this moment of, I'm going to set this down and I'm going to write a short story to clear my head. And for this short story, my prompt for myself is to use none of the tropes that I normally use in my writing and to do something completely different, which is when I went down this rabbit hole of what's a time period I know nothing about? What's a setting I've never used? I've never used a library as a setting. What's a magic system that I've never heard of? As I started to just grab these random plot ideas of things I had never written before, I had this idea of a book that won't stay where it belongs because of magic, and an idea for a romance that's not the source of the tension for the plot. So, still realistic, but the tension of the plot is not the couple being unable to work out their relationship. And so I sat down and I wrote this short story, and I showed it to a couple of author friends, and it was like an intervention for like when you have a problem. They were all like, "This is not a short story. It's the first third of a novel. You've set up a novel and you have to finish it. You're not allowed to not finish it."
Yes,
And that short story, quote unquote, that I wrote is more or less the first third of Misshelved Magic.
that's awesome.
So that's how it was not supposed to be my first novel. It wasn't even supposed to be a novel. It's none of the normal tropes that I write. It's not the normal tone I write in. And something about having to go that far out of my comfort zone is part of what makes it so special.
That's so fun to hear.
Yeah.
I love that. So, what encouragement do you hope your readers will take away from this story?
that having virtue is always the right choice, even when the stakes are high. It can seem sometimes like going along to get along is the right thing to do, but when we just focus on what's the right thing to do in this circumstance, that's always better than toning down our virtue and our conscience to make other people comfortable.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about Misshelved Magic. Where can readers find both you and your book online?
Yeah, I have a website, SR Crickard, no dots. It's just spelled out, srcrickard.com. And then I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok as SR Crickard. Again, no dots or anything. And I'm most of all on Instagram. I like to keep touch with people there.
And I will link to that in the show notes so readers can find you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope readers will enjoy finding your book.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to A Spot of Story with Danielle Grandinetti. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Let us know by leaving a comment below, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Discover more information about today's book by visiting A Spot of Story online at daniellegrandinetti.com/podcast. Happy reading!